Yeah, it looks like everybody's logged in. Welcome everyone to our inaugural conversation. We so appreciate you spending a little bit of your Wednesday evening with us and participating in our inaugural program. I'm Sam Landis. My pronouns are they, them. I'm queer, non-binary, a creative, and a history nerd. I am currently the senior designer at the National Center for Civil and Human Rights. And most relevant to this evening, I am a co-founder of the Atlanta LGBTQ History Project and the moderator for tonight's conversation. This project started after a conversation I had with one of my co-founders, Rachel Ward, this summer, but it has been something that I've wanted to do for a long time. It's something that I think is needed. With this project, we hope to gather, share, and preserve the stories of Atlanta's LGBTQ leaders and groundbreakers in their own voices. We plan to launch our podcast in the beginning of 2022 and hold an in-person exhibit in the spring or summer of 2022. But tonight we launch our project with a conversation about preserving trans histories in the South for Trans Awareness Week. Rachel, if you want to go to the next one. I'm really excited to have Professor Kadji Amin of Emory University, Dee Dee Chamblee, the Executive Director of LaGender Inc., and archivist Morna Gerrard of Georgia State University's Special Collections. A quick note of housekeeping. If you have questions, feel free to add them in the chat or the Q&A option if it's working. And depending on the time, we'll try to include some Q&A towards the end. We want this project to be a project for our community by our community. So we encourage you to please check out our website if you haven't already and to follow us on social. We would love to hear from you, be it for nominations, people who you think we should include, or perhaps you want to donate to the work that we're doing. And on that note, I just want to do a quick shout out to our project partners, the LGBTQ Institute at the National Center for Civil and Human Rights, WISI Magazine, and Imago Dei at Columbia Theological Seminary. These partners have been super supportive in this project, and we're super grateful for them, as well as our project sponsors. So far, our funding has come from a generous gift from Will Zaw and Kira Christoph, and as a gift from Columbia Seminary. We believe in preserving and sharing Southern LGBTQ history, and we invite you to sponsor or donate to the project so that we can make this project the best that it can be. This will enable us to pay LGBTQ photographers, pay for our website, to fund our podcast, and to fund our exhibit to come in 2022. Now, before we have our deeper introductions and begin our discussion, I wanted to spend a moment of reflection and remembrance for the members of the trans and non-binary community that we have lost this year. I encourage you to take a moment and read through the names. Due to time, we don't have time to read through the names this evening, but I just want to pause and have a moment of reflection. Thank you for taking this moment with me. I'm now going to introduce our fabulous panelists. First up, we have Dee Dee Chamblee, who is the Executive Director and founder of LaGender Inc., a nonprofit organization led by African-American trans women that empowers and lifts up the spirits of transgender women of color in the metro Atlanta area. Ms. Chamblee is a survivor and advocate living with HIV/AIDS for 25 years. Ms. Chamblee founded LaGender in 2001 to address the unique needs of the transgender community surrounding issues such as HIV/AIDS, homelessness, incarceration, mental health, wellness, discrimination, and hate crime violence. Our next panelist is Professor Kadji Amin, and I apologize, I'm working really hard to pronounce correctly. Professor Amin is the Associate Professor of Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at Emory University. He's the recipient of a Mellon Postdoctoral Fellowship in Sex from the University of Pennsylvania and a Humanities Institute Faculty Fellowship from Stony Brook University. His book, Disturbing Attachments, Genet, Modern Pedestry and Queer History, won an honorable mention for Best Book in LGBT Studies from the Caucus of the Modern Language Association. He's currently at work on a second book on trans empiricism. And finally, last but not least, we have Morna Gerrard, who is the Women's Gender and Sexuality Collections Archivist in Special Collections and Archives at the Georgia State University Library. She serves on the National Center for Civil and Human Rights LGBTQ Institute Advisory Board, the Historic Atlanta LGBTQ HPAC Board, and from 2011 to 2018 was the Vice President of the Georgia LGBTQ Archives Project. She has published a number of articles and chapters, including No Fame Required, Collaboration, Community, and the LGBTQ Archives Project, an Appraisal and Acquisition, Innovative Practices for Archives and Special Collections, Exploring Gender Roles in Society, Literature, and Film, and Gender Studies in the Library, Case Studies, Programming, Outreach, and Acting Up, Down South, and the Alexander Street Press Women and Social Movements in the US. 16,000 to present electronic journal. Thank you all for joining us. And I'm going to welcome all the panelists to turn their cameras back on. Thank you for joining us. Now we get to get into the why we're all here, the conversation. I first want to have you each tell us a little bit about the work that you do. We just read your bios, but maybe you can tell us a little bit more. And more specifically for this evening, how it intersects with the trans community. We'll start with you, Ms. Chamblee.
Good afternoon, everyone. And thank y'all for having me on this historic project. Now that I'm still living, to tell the story. My job here in Atlanta has been to advocate and to have a voice for Black trans women, especially Black trans women who are suffering from HIV and AIDS. The infection rate was nearly 85% at one time, at the time when I was coming through, and there was so many deaths. We couldn't even keep up with who was dying. And a lot of us died alone. A lot of us died on the abandoned bridges, abandoned houses, alone. Yes. So we advocate in all areas. Services are needed so desperately everywhere. I mean, I started out advocating for homeless shelters. And the next thing I know, I was doing incarceration. I was doing mental health. I was doing HIV and AIDS. So it was from one thing to the other. And most of those things led to HIV and AIDS. I came up during the time when not having those services put you at risk for HIV and AIDS. Being homeless, being ostracized from your family, not having that support, being bullied, so you didn't complete school. So you had no alternatives but to survive. And that only thing left for you to survive doing was survival sex work. And it's not something that I'm proud of, but it kept me alive. It kept me eating. It kept me with a place to stay when I tried to receive services, which was usually a zoo. Just going into that health department was like a literal zoo. And when I came on the scene, oh, I was the zoo master. So, made fun of. I mean, the staff would come out and everybody would look like you a creature from outer space. Like they ain't never seen nobody like you before. And the sniggering and tickling and the monkeys, as I would call them, the monkeys would come out. And you had to go through all that just to get seen. And as far as getting housing or food or shelter, you will always be told, if we have HIV, we'll be able to help you. But until then, there's no services for people like you. So that really discouraged me because I knew that there were a whole community of people living under these circumstances like I was. And the fact that you would have to be disrespected and misgendered just to get seen about from a doctor or a nurse. And during that time, they wouldn't even touch you. And we knew to pack a lunch because we was going to be there all day. And you better carry your own food or you might miss your appointment. Because if they call you, they're not going to wait for you. You just missed your appointment. And it was very important because I was at a point where hopeless was beyond the word. Because growing up, being a sex worker was not what I had dreamed my life would be. The glamour and the glitz of the nightclub and the freedom of this is the only place where you can be free. Only place where you could be yourself and that you can have joy in spite of the circumstances you were dealt with. So nightclub became our babysitter because we were good babies, 14 and 15 years old, running away from home. No place to go. There were no shelters. There was one travel lodge down on 12th Street, right there where that liquor store is now, called the Travel Lodge. And it received the LGBT teens during that time. And we stayed there and they fed us and they took care of us, good care of us. We had a place to stay in a bed, sleeping. But that's as far as it went. During those early years,
It sounds like you've lived through quite a bit, Ms. Chamblee. I appreciate you sharing a little bit about that, and I look forward to hearing more about that throughout the discussion.
Thank you, Sam.
Let's go to Professor Amin. Can you tell us a little bit more about the work that you do and how it intersects with the trans community?
Sure. First of all, thank you for having me. And I was very excited to hear that this project was even happening. And also thank you for, sharing your story, Miss Chamblee. It's incredibly moving, and I can't wait to hear more of what you have to say. Um, so I'm a professor at Emory University, and my areas of specialization are queer studies and trans studies. My first book was mainly in queer studies, and now I'm shifting over more to trans studies. So some of the work that I do involves teaching. I teach trans studies at both the undergraduate and the graduate level. And I've been doing so for a while now at the undergraduate level. And one thing that really interests me is some of the transformations in queer and trans identity and community now. So for instance, this year I'm teaching trans studies on the undergraduate level, and it's the first year ever that more than half of the students in the class have been either trans or non-binary identified. And as you can imagine, it's completely different teaching to a class of trans and non-binary majority students than teaching to a bunch of cis students. The kinds of questions you can ask, the kinds of conversations you can have, the kind of community building that you can do in the classroom is completely different, and it's really fun. And also at the graduate level, I am teaching for the first time actually a class on trans studies. And that's significant because the graduate students I'm teaching, the idea is that some of them may go on to become professors and academics themselves. And so one thing that I would like to be doing, that I hope I'm doing, is forming the next generation of researchers, right? And in fact, one of the assignments that I had, and this was just for a week that I was going to be out of town in my grad seminar, I asked my students, I'm sure you're aware of this New York Public Library oral history project, queer GLBT. I'm not sure how they name it. I can't remember how they name it exactly. But it's an open project where people are given the tools to learn to do oral histories and interview people themselves. And then those oral histories are digitized so that anybody can access them. And so I asked my students to, based on whatever criteria they wanted, go to the website and listen to a few of those oral histories. And one student had found, who is a member of ballroom culture and is also working on ballroom culture, found that one of the people that they had interviewed had also been interviewed online, which they were not aware of. And another student who had done ethnographic research in South Korea and is also Korean, had been really excited to find that project, and now wants a component of her dissertation, which is going to be on trans women in South Korea, to be interviewing trans women in South Korea, but also teaching other people to do that and finding a way to make those interviews public, but also to retain anonymity, because many people don't want to be known, don't want to be locatable in terms of, but do want their stories and their histories to be told. So I think that oral history is incredibly important. It's a way that we can maintain a relationship across the generations to those who have preceded us, and that we can think of ourselves as parts of history as well, right? And if you don't mind, I'll just be talking with my cat here for the moment. And so the book project that I'm working on is, it's still kind of taking shape. I'm calling it trans empiricism in part because as I've been spending time, empiricism in academic speak just refers to bodies of work that rely on evidence, right? The idea of looking and finding what happened in history, right? Or looking and finding what people have to say about themselves and how they understand themselves, right? So I chose this title because as I spent some time in the field of trans studies, I started to feel like the prerogatives of the field have been oriented a lot by theory, right? By queer theory, which came before it, and feminist theory, which came before it. And so a lot of trans studies work has sought to dialogue with queer and feminist theory in order to make a place for trans people and trans lives, right? Because of the ways that trans scholars have seen feminist theory and queer theory in different ways, either erase trans lives or judge them, right? Or see them as anti-feminist in some way. And so I understand the turn to theory, but at the same time, I feel that there's so much more to trans lives and to trans histories than the question of what they have to say to queer or feminist theory, right? And so much of that richness, you know, either has not been adequately documented or has a significance that hasn't been paid sufficient attention to, right? So sometimes we have these stories, we have this documentation, but we don't think to ourselves, you know, maybe our trans theory should be based on this rather than on a response to queer theory or feminist theory, right? And, you know, theory is a big word. It can seem really alienating to some people, but part of what I want to point out in my book is that even the idea of gender identity is a theory, right? There are everyday theories for talking about people's lives. There are everyday theories for accounting for different types of people in the world, including trans people, including queer people. And there are academic theories, right? And sometimes the everyday theories have a lot to show the academic theories. And so that's one thing that I think that history can teach us, right? We can find that trans people in history or queer people in history had their own ways of understanding themselves and had their own ways of understanding their relationship to work, right? To sex, to their bodies, right? To other people. And that not only challenge queer and feminist theories, but that may be the site of their own kind of theorization, right? And so, you know, one thing that interests me, for instance, is that gender identity is a theory that emerged out of psychiatry in the mid-century, in the 1950s, right? And now we as trans people see it as so necessary to affirm our internal sense of our own identities, right? But before the 1950s, and even after the 1950s, because it's not as if that idea caught on immediately among queer and trans communities. So in these earlier decades, there were trans people, right? There were people who were not gender conforming. There were cross-dressers, right? And they didn't need the concept of gender identity or the concept of a division between gender and sex in order to exist, right? And not only in order to exist, but in order to be recognized by other people, right? And so, so part of what I'm trying to do is retrieve these alternative understandings of what it meant to be trans, or according to what understandings of the world one could be trans, right? In order to show that, you know, not only that we have always existed, but also that there are multiple, you know, different ways to imagine what it is and what it can be like, you know, multiple different ways to rationalize, you know, the foundation upon which trans identity is based, right? And I think that's important in a political situation when trans identity is being constantly attacked, you know, and said to be not true. Gender is said to be an ideology or even a strange religion, right? Religious cult, using the language of I believe it was one of the Arkansas cases. And so I think that we need to be very, very open about what kind of rationales we turn to. We don't need to dig our heels in around one particular idea of this is why trans people exist and this is why we must be recognized, because there are so many different tools that we actually have at our disposal. So yeah, I'll just stop there, but happy to talk more later.
No, I love all of that. It gets me excited to continue this conversation, especially hearing about the work with your students. That's incredibly exciting and definitely speaks to why we're here tonight and why we have this project. you know, and a great way to pivot to Morna, in the work that you do with recording oral histories. Do you mind telling us a little bit more about your work? Just unmute first.
Sorry about that. Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Okay. So first of all, Sam and Rachel, thank you for inviting this very enthusiastic ally into this conversation. I feel really privileged that you've allowed me to be part of this. I really, truly appreciate it. As you know, I'm the archivist for women's and gender and sexuality collections at Georgia State. And in that role, I generally collect and preserve and arrange and describe and make available materials from our LGBTQ plus communities, as well as using them for teaching and right currently we're working on a podcast about HIV and AIDS. We tend to, we collect all of these materials, but we don't just let them sit on shelves. We like to use them and make sure that other people are using them and have free access to them. I've actually been super productive about making sure that my work is intersecting with the trans communities. Our collections were established in 2011. The gender and sexuality collections were established in 2011. And we've been collecting at a pretty, what I would call a pretty strong pace. So much so that we kind of changed the name of the collection in 2017 to sort of like isolate just the gender and sexuality part of it. What I've noticed in all of that time, and I know archivists all across the country, excuse me, I've got a cat who's going a little rogue. Archivists all across the country and around the world, I think, they noticed if they're collecting in this area, is that we have a lot of materials from privileged white gay men mostly, and you know, we do have some materials from white lesbians, but beyond that, there are voices and faces missing. And I really feel that the trans community is one of the most invisible communities in terms of representation in special collections and in archives. And I always, when I see that things are missing, I feel very strongly that we need to address that and fill in the gaps and honor those histories that have not been told. So throughout my frustration, I actually assigned myself as one of my goals for the year is to create a transgender oral history project that would focus on the lives of any trans person or gender non-conforming person living, working in Georgia, or who has lived or worked or existed in Georgia, had some experiences in Georgia. And what was quite cool toward the end of the year, last year, while I was making all of these plans, I received an email from a student in California, Panella, who was struggling to find an internship because all the California schools were no longer taking interns because of COVID. And he asked if he could intern for me. And I was like, I don't know that I'm ready for an intern because of COVID. But he explained that he was trans and that he was really interested in trans voices and trans history. And so it felt like the universe was throwing us together. And I've had a really wonderful year working with him, as well as trans volunteers and advisors, to get my project off the ground. And something I'm very, very aware of is, first of all, my privilege, but also the fact that I am an ally. I'm not a trans person. And I really felt that in order to make the people being interviewed feel safe and seen and heard properly, that anybody conducting interviews had to be trans. I would not conduct the interviews. I am not qualified to do that. I will manage the project and allow my volunteers to do all of the wonderful work that they're doing. And so far, I feel like that's been a really positive approach. And we didn't do this, I completely out of the blue. I did a lot of research before we started this project, talking to archivists and oral historians across the country who have been working on similar projects to find out what worked and what didn't work, things to avoid. And there are lots of practical technology things that after the interviews that we've got to worry about, but there were certainly lots of things in setting up a project like this. And I feel really comfortable that we've approached it thoroughly, and I've done this not in a heterosexual vacuum or cisgender vacuum. I've done this with a lot of trans advice and help, and I'm super, super grateful for that. So it is a project that is in its early days, but it's an open-ended project that will just keep going until we've completely run out of people, but I don't think that's ever going to happen. And I'm super excited to see where it's going to go. Yeah, so, and I can talk more about the project itself if you want me to.
Yeah, that's actually a really great pivot into our first question for you. Wanted to ask that as an archivist, as you're working on this problem, and you spoke to a little bit as, recognizing your own privilege, but and navigating that. What are some other things that have surprised you in this work of gathering LGBTQ history and trans histories? And maybe what are some challenges that you faced while doing it?
I think my biggest challenge, to be honest, is my imposter syndrome. It's like, here I am, sitting on my privilege and working for the man. I work in an academic institution. There's a lot that comes along with that, a lot of baggage that comes along with that. And breaking down all of that has been a challenge I have welcomed and worked really hard to do. We have, there is this, when you're doing an oral history with somebody who works at a university, there's this perceived power dynamic that I want to kind of do away with. And something that we've worked very, very hard to do is to give all of the power and the decision making about each individual interview back to the person being interviewed. The interviewees can decide exactly what happens to their interview, exactly what they'll talk about in their interview. All of the choices are theirs. And even, after, if they decide that their interview wants to be put online and we can do all sorts of things with it, and then, they come back and say, no, I don't want to do that, that's totally fine. We're really, it's like, whatever folks want, that is what we will do. My couple of things that I have learned and been surprised about, I probably shouldn't have been surprised, but I think with the LGBTQ, people talk about the LGBTQ community, and it's really, I don't see it as a community. I see it as a bunch of communities that identify in different ways. And sometimes they are working in harmony, they're living in harmony. And to be honest, like looking back in history and talking to people and all of that, sometimes there's been conflict, and we tend to forget within movements that it's not just everyone's in the same sort of place and with the same agenda and the same goals and the same desires and the same needs. Each community has their own specific needs and desires. And I really feel that needs to be stressed a lot more. What's surprised me, and this kind of comes along at the back end of my imposter syndrome, is how welcoming and supportive the LGBTQ plus communities have been of not just me and the work that I do, but the collections that we have as well. They are without doubt some of the most passionate and supportive and encouraging people I've ever met in my life, and I feel very, very privileged to be working with them. I see them as true allies, and as a cis hetero sort of ally myself, they and some of them are probably here in this meeting. People like Lorraine Fontana, who I know is here, they have been amazing bridge builders into communities that have, because of those bridges, have welcomed myself and other archivists into their world, and have been willing to trust us with preserving their lives' histories and their works. I mean, that's just incredible gift that they've been able to give us.
I know I, for one, am super grateful for this work that you've done, and especially for all of your advice as we've been launching our project. Pivoting back to you, Miss Chamblee, wanted to revisit, you were giving us a lot of storytelling and kind of giving us some of your background. I'd love to hear a little bit more about why did you choose to advocate for yourself and others in the trans community? That's not a decision that everyone in the trans community makes. Why did that speak to you?
I got tired of being disrespected. I got tired of being treated less than human. I knew that we need to get these services because we were dying in such droves. I knew we had to get through those doors. And I knew the only way that the girls were going to come was that the staff, that front office staff, was my first barrier and my first battleground. To train those people at the front desk of how to, because they always had the same reasons, you know. I don't know those people. I'm not one of those people. I don't know how to treat those people. I don't know how to address those people. And so the point of just fact of training them to say, all you have to do is ask them, how would you like for me to identify you? That simple thing was mind blowing. I could have got a PhD. But you know, I'm saying that to be funny, but it was diffused to me why something so simple as asking a person that would not come to you in a situation like that. You know, you're a caregiver, a service provider, and it doesn't say you only provide services to certain people. It says you provide service to all people. And I'm a person. So, you know, and I knew that the front desk had to be trained. So I set out doing trainings. At my first job I got is myself. Never thought I would be able to get one because this job discrimination is another chapter. Job discrimination. I wouldn't be able to get a job. I mean, everywhere I applied for a job, they would either throw the application in the garbage, or you know, they would give me some kind of excuse. But I always knew what it was from the time I walked in the door. It's something about a trans person. When we walk into the room, we transform the energy in that room. And learning how to transform that energy in the room was my second barrier, because I had to go to the Round White Council. I had to go to the Georgia Planning Council. I had to go to these entities that had never seen a person like me before and speak to them And as soon as I walked into the front door, the whole room would turn around, literally, the whole room. I know I'm a gorgeous 6'2" Amazon of a woman, but the whole room, and then it wasn't a welcoming. It was like, what are you doing here? You don't belong here. Nobody wants to see you. Nobody wants to see a man in a dress. This was the attitude and the culture of which we had to try to survive in at the time. And then being Black and trans, walking down the street, you were going to jail. If you were Black and you were trans, you were going to jail. Did you do anything? Did you break a law? It was the unwritten law. And that culture was permeating alongside of all the other atrocities that were happening to our community. And yeah, I decided that I was not going to just lay down and take it anymore. I had been laying there waiting to die. For 7 years, I laid there and waited to die because everybody was dying around me. So I thought, well, I haven't done nothing no different than they have done. My turn is coming too. My number is coming just like theirs. Well, it never did come. So I said, well, I guess I better brush this dirt off of me and these flowers, throw these flowers to the side and get up from here and decide, why am I still here? And that's when I, received the calling that that I was worthy, that I was loved by God, because I'm a very spiritual woman. I was loved by God. I was not an afterthought. And that I need to claim that and receive that. Because when I found out that God did love me, my whole life just changed overnight. I got my first job, like I said, down at the infectious disease clinic on Pump. And I got it just by going to my doctor's appointment. And someone saw me there, and I would volunteer and push people in, and I would be ministering to people and singing church songs and going and buying them lunch. And I would just do all that. When my appointment day came, I spent the whole day at the clinic. So one day, Mr. Jimmy, who worked at Outreach, which is an organization that had a contract there, he saw me. He said, "Miss Dee Dee, you work here?" I said, "No, Mr. Jimmy." I said, "I just like pushing the people and seeing about them and stuff while I'm here." He said, "Well, yeah, I got a job for you." And I said, "You do?" And he said, "Yes." And he gave me a job right there in the clinic. I had my own desk and everything. And I was going to work that first day, going to work. Oh, I never forget that day. Had my little suit on. You couldn't tell me nothing. I have a job as me. How liberating, how empowering to a trans person that has done survival sex work all their life. But when I got to the front door, the spirit stopped me and said, "Look across the street." And I looked across the street, and all of a sudden I saw me on that corner that used to be my corner. I used to run girls off that corner because that was my corner, jumping in and out of cars, turning tricks. And then the Spirit said to me, look how long it took for you to cross the street. Right there, I just crumbled and fell right there at the door because it was just, had come full circle. This had been like maybe 7 years from the time I got up off of my deathbed to going into the front door of that clinic and to my job. It was just so surreal, the whole thing was for me. And little did I know that my job was going to start immediately because the people in the clinic did not want to honor my new name change and my new identity. They want to continue to call me the old name and still misgender me. I mean, and do it maliciously. So I went to the head administrator and I told her about it. And she said, well, we got to do something about this. She said, we're going to order an in-service training for the whole staff on cultural competency. I didn't know what cultural competency was. I said, oh, okay, let's do it. And she got this woman that I respect to this day, Erin Swenson, who was the first trans Presbyterian minister here in Atlanta. She called her in, and that was the first time I had met a person like her with a PhD, you know, and a trans person. So that whole thing was just empowering to me, that whole exchange. And Erin helped me do the training. And after the training was over, the administrator said, now everyone, if there are grounds to be written up for disrespecting or misgendering trans people. And it could be grounds for termination. From this day forward, you can't say you don't know, because you have now been trained. Meeting adjourned. That clinic turned around overnight. Overnight. Oh, when I got to work the next morning, oh, it was, good morning, ma'am. How you doing, Miss Chamblee? Oh, good. I said, am I in the same place? What is going on? It was just another thing I learned, that when you put some teeth to your policies and hit that checkbook, it's amazing how people's ideas and ways can change. It's amazing. That was just amazing to me to see that our whole clinic transformed like that overnight. It was amazing. I couldn't believe it. So, and once I finally learned how to do a cultural competency training on the job. I just took it and I just ran with it. And I went to every organization that I could. I didn't even have a car. I was boots on the ground, literally boots on the ground. And I just went to everyone that I could. I went to every university, I went to so many places I can't even name all the places I went. But I knew every door that I went in was going to be another door open, because they kept saying, we don't see them, Miss Dee Dee. You're the only one we see. There are no numbers to substantiate you even exist. Like, how you gonna tell a 6'2" woman she don't exist? And they told me this over and over and over again. So I had to create LaGender. I had to create LaGender in order to have a voice. They did not listen to me. They would not listen to me until I created the organization. I had to create an organization on top of everything else that I was doing. And I had some great people like Jamie Roberts, Monica Helms, oh, so many that really helped and supported me getting LaGender started. And LaGender was really one, if not the first trans organization to receive funding here in Atlanta. We received funding from the U.S. Conference of Mayors in DC, and that got us started out. We developed a contract with the municipal courts office to where they started releasing people to us and letting them join into our program. We were there. They told us we were the first place they had to send people that were trans. The jail was the only other alternative. So the jail was being used as a homeless shelter and a mental health facility and everything else for trans people.
It's really incredible to hear all the work that has been done that you've been a part of, and how much things have changed and how much things in some ways haven't changed. You mentioned Monica Helms, who's actually someone that I was hoping to have be a part of this conversation tonight, but she was not able to join us this evening, but will hopefully be a part of future conversations. But as you speak to, the discrimination that trans and non-binary people face, so much of that goes back to lack of representation and lack of, our stories being told. And like you said, people just not knowing how to interact with someone that looks so different from what they've experienced before. And so I want to talk a little bit about, to that point, why is it so important that we tell these stories? Why is it so important that we record, trans histories and non-binary history and share that with people? We'll go to Professor Amin, you first. Maybe you can talk a little bit about what scholarship has been done on queer and trans histories in the South, and what still needs to be done.
Sure, I'll try to speak to both of those things. So the first history that I came across of queer, that was specifically a queer history focused on the South, was John Howard's Men Like That. And it was published posthumously. Unfortunately, he died before he was able to complete it. But it was interesting because it was based on oral history interviews that he himself had done in Mississippi. And so he had talked to people in Mississippi who had been around since the 1930s, and through the 1950s, through the 1970s. And at the time I was fairly young. So one thing that had astonished me was the degree, and his book was focused on men, but was the degree of same-sex activity happening between men in the South, right? In these small towns, including in places where you absolutely would not expect it, such as in churches. And so, it was largely an account of transient sexual encounters, but also some bar spaces where there were gatherings of queer community. And I think, that book helped me think differently about what the possibilities were in the past, especially in the South. Now there's a growing body of work, but still, the most work on queer and trans history has been focused on New York and San Francisco, these major coastal cities that have been important in part because they're port cities and there's been so much passage through them and so much immigration to them. And because of that high degree of mobility, there's a certain anonymity, a possibility for new communities to form, and a possibility for sexual encounters and for sex work as well. And so I understand why that focus has happened, but recently, I think starting in the early 2000s, there's been a move in terms of history gathering to kind of problematize this idea that in order to be queer, you had to move to a major city, especially New York or San Francisco, and to think about the history of people in rural spaces or in the South. So the kind of rural turn in queer studies. So we have Colin Johnson's book, Just Queer Folks, E. Patrick Johnson's Sweet Tea, which is about Black gay men in the South specifically, and Emily Skidmore's True Sex, which is about trans men at the turn of the century in the US in general, that has a chapter that focuses specifically on trans men in rural areas. And one thing that a bunch of these historians have pointed out is that rural areas in some cases offered advantages that urban areas did not. There's in smaller towns, there can be structures of familiarity, right? Where you belong to the small town, people know you, and you may be an eccentric. There are a lot of oddballs in small towns, but you're tolerated and you're kind of taken care of. Of course, there are limits to this care, right? But I think in the present, we often assume that queer people and trans people were always beyond those limits, which was not always the case, right? So for instance, Emily Skidmore finds that at the turn of the 20th century, a lot, maybe the majority of trans men that historians have been able to find chose to live in rural areas rather than in urban areas, even when they moved around a lot, right? And so, we have the beginnings of some knowledge about what life was like in rural areas, what life was like in Southern queer areas. But there still remain so many questions, right? So for instance, a city like Atlanta disrupts the whole rural urban paradigm because the South in general has been thought of as one giant rural space, right? Atlanta is clearly urban and cosmopolitan, but not like New York City, not like San Francisco, this kind of port city. So, what was life like for urban queers in the South? And also how might the stories that people who moved to Atlanta from smaller places, from smaller, cities and towns in the South, what might that tell us about what it was like to be queer or trans in a small town? And I think one question that I really have also is how this differs for trans men and trans women, right? I think the kind of stories that Skidmore is telling about trans men passing, before there were hormones or surgeries, is a lot harder to imagine with trans women, right? And part of what Skidmore is also saying is that in rural areas, there was such a value on masculinity in terms of doing hard farm labor and things like that, right? That even if somebody was discovered to have been passing as a trans man, the fact that he was a hard worker allowed people to continue to respect him and for him to continue to have his place, right? So were there different patterns of socialization, of labor, right, between trans men and trans women? And that's the kind of work that we still have to do. And I think now I'm forgetting what your other, why these histories are important. So just one quick, pretty simple thing. In queer and trans culture, there's a tendency for each generation to reinvent itself. Generational turnover, the generations I think happen a lot faster than in straight culture, and there are a lot fewer routes of intergenerational transmission, right? So people often don't socialize together if they're from different generations. bar spaces are sometimes seen as spaces only for the young, right? And there are huge exceptions to this. I think house ball culture is one of them, in which there are forms of intergenerational transmission, or I think of the mothering work that trans femmes, especially trans femmes of color, do. But overall, it seems like that separation is a feature of queer history. And combined with, in addition to that, we have this progress narrative about queer and trans history, which to some extent is true, which is that, things are getting better. In the past, they were a lot worse, right? But I think that leads people also to imagine that everything was always dire in the past, right? That there were no moments or place or sites, right, where there was flourishing or pleasure or community, right, or acceptance, and also to overgeneralize the ways that we understand what gay and lesbian and trans are now, and to imagine that these are ways that people have always understood themselves. So I think one of the things that queer and trans history can do is to show us, well, in a way to show us that we are not here standing at the pinnacle of history looking down on others who came before us, right? But that they may have known things that we don't even have an inkling of, right? They may have had skills that we can't even imagine, right? And at certain times and at certain places, they may have had forms of community and forms of culture, right? And creativity that are actually at the core of queer culture now and trans culture now, because we've inherited them, we've forgotten where they came from. And in some cases, they may not be at the core of queer and trans culture now. And that's in part is because of this fast turnover between generations, this forgetting of our own history, right? And this sense, this overconfidence that where we are now is the best and the smartest we've ever been, and that we don't actually have something to learn from the past. And I think oral history in particular points to the fact that actually there are people here right now who are still living and can tell us that history. It's not something that is lost or that, can't be found, if it's not written in the archives, it doesn't exist, right? That's not true, actually. There are living repositories of history, such as Miss Dee Dee right here, who could tell us a lot.
So many good points, and so many directions I want to go with that question. At first, I want to note that we are at 8 o'clock, and I want to check and see if y'all are okay with continuing on a little bit longer, just a little bit, so we can talk just a little bit more. I want to first get Morna, your thoughts on some of the things that Professor Amin talked about, and how oral history can help us share these trans histories with more nuance. And then we're going to loop around to you, Miss Dee Dee, and would love to hear you share a little bit about what Professor Amin was just talking about, how, our histories are not just about pain and suffering, but they are stories of joy and resilience too, and would love to hear some from you about that.
So yeah, I really liked the point about, the way that the community is kind of as seen as they're looked at in a very general way. So one of the things, there's so many great things about oral histories. I am the biggest fan of oral history. And I realized today, I've been doing it for over 20 years, which really shocks me and makes me feel old. But what stands out so much about oral history is that every single person, every single human being has a unique and important story to tell. Doesn't matter who you are, where you came from, who your parents were, what you do for a living or don't do for a living. Everyone has a very important and unique story to tell. And it's really easy for people outside of any community to see a particular community as just homogenous and, oh, your history is all just like this blob. And I think oral histories really break that down, because they're subjective. They're based on individual memory and individual, they're affected by your race, your class, your age, where you live, what your parents' political views were, whether you were a second or a third child. All sorts of things come into play with doing oral histories, so that the uniqueness kind of shines through with each interview. And even the way people tell their stories. I mean, we're very clear in with our transcripts. We actually have a disclaimer saying this is a subjective piece of information. It's based on memory and all that comes along with memory. You know, how people remember specific events, even if they were all at the same event, can be very, very different based on some of the things I already talked about, maybe even based on if they were hungry at the time or mad at their mother at the time or whatever. It's like that can actually really affect your remembering of events. And I find that unique and amazing and wonderful. And it's important to honor whatever those, you know, however somebody wants to tell their story and whatever that story is. One of my favorite things, we did an oral history with women after the Trump inauguration. We did some women's march oral histories with over 100 women, and you know, each person was at a march somewhere, and some, you know, a lot of them were at the same march, but my goodness, they remembered so many different things, and so many, you know, the smells, the sounds, the feelings, all of that was different for each individual person. And that's one of the unique and amazing things about oral history is it fills in the blanks where, I mean, thank goodness we have oral history for the communities that I document, which are so underdocumented. Having oral history as a way to just sometimes create that history, because it doesn't always exist. And for the people who took part in that history to tell their own story and not have it told by somebody outside of themselves is really, really important. Official records for organizations only tell you what the official records want to tell you. They tell you, you know, what happened basically, but they don't tell you always how that happened, who was involved in making it happen, what did people think about it as it was happening, who disagreed about it, who, you know, there's so many facets that are completely missing from, you know, the archival document. That oral history really is like the best and most unique way of filling in those blanks, and you know, it's just so damn human, and it humanizes history. And I think that's one of the reasons, you know, we have a lot of students working with our collections, and they always gravitate toward the oral histories because they either see themselves in them, or but they feel this humanity. It makes history tangible and real. When we talk about smells, or we talk about, you know, feelings, it allows people to sort of jump into the shoes of somebody and I think much more fully embrace their experiences.
Absolutely. And to that point, we'll bring you back in, Ms. Chamblee, and just want to note that I had a question about where we can hear more of Ms. Chamblee's stories, and I just want to plug that our first podcast episode is actually going to feature Ms. Dee Dee. She graced us with her stories, and she's the first oral history that one of the first oral histories that we recorded, and so. If you want to hear more of her stories, that will be available soon, along with many others. But, you know, while we have you here, you know, would love to hear your thoughts on, you know, some of those moments, those stories of joy and resilience, that maybe a specific story that feels really meaningful to you.
Oh, when I was honored as one of the first champions of change by President Obama, who I didn't think knew I existed. I mean, I was down here in little old East Point, Georgia, doing my work as I usually do, seeing about the children. And I get a phone call from the White House. At first, I thought it was a bill collector. So I didn't want to answer the phone. But the Spirit told me to answer the phone. And when I answered the phone, it said, "This is the White House. We would like to speak to Ms. Chamblee." And I didn't know whether it was me or not, because I still thinking, oh, they done caught up with me. They done found something in my past to get me for having such a loud mouth. So, this is the Obama administration, and President Obama would like to invite you to the White House. We are honoring you as a champion of change. I said, this can't be real. This can't be true. Me? Yes, you. And we want you to come to the White House. I had never been to the White House. And then to be invited to the White House, I thought it was just out of body experience for a person like me. But it let me know that there was a God. And there was a God that had appointed me to do this. When I got to the gates of the White House, and Spirit said, now the gates are open. And after that, the White House was flooded with trans people. We had so many meetings. I mean, we had one meeting in the White House with all of the trans identities. I did not know that there were so many identities. And I had never seen them gather into one space. And it was just, my mouth was open the whole time. I was just floored, overwhelmed by all of the identity, and that we were there together, and we loved on each other, and we had dances, we had parties in the White House. The girls fell in the floor, they danced all upside the walls. We had Tina Turner. I mean, it was, and I was just sitting there watching this and saying, wow, I feel like Whoopi in The Color Purple. I mean, I just would have never have dreamed that I would have lived to see a day like that. And then I said, well, girls, y'all better dance now, because we don't know when we're going to get this chance to dance again. Little did I know what was coming. But anyway, all swears and love and war. I immediately left the reception with Miss Obama and President Obama. They landed down in the helicopter in front of us and got out and came into the White House and said, welcome to your home. This is your home, and you are welcome here. Oh, so endearing, so loving. I mean, we could sit on the furniture. You know, we was in the White House with all the antique stuff there. And they had champagne and oysters Rockefeller. And we were wined and dined, and I just felt like a princess. I really did that. If I ever felt like a princess, that was the night I felt like a princess. And I immediately went over to the Martin Luther King memorial because he had just been completed. I immediately went over to Chicago Cap and went over there and just fell beneath that big statue. And they said that for the tears and the blood that you shed, for the first Black trans woman to be honored as a champion of change by the first Black president. I couldn't believe it, only because of your blood and tears that this day was even ever possible. And I have to give homage and honor to Martin Luther King. I always felt I was walking in his shoes. They used to call me the Moses of the trans movement during the time because when nobody had brave enough to go out there and battle the evil forces that were against us. And there were so many, but we made a lot of friends along the way. We made a lot of champions like Morna and Rachel. And now I'm meeting Kadji, a professor of trans studies. Oh, that is everything. That is everything to me. And you know, because I look at this, one of my children, look, yes, you know, we no longer have to, you know, settle for the things that were in my past. You know, that we have a lot of things to look forward to. When I look in Kadji's eyes, I just see that my living was not in vain. I knew you were coming.
Thank you so much. What an honor to be coming after you.
I knew you were coming.
Thank you so much for sharing that beautiful, beautiful story. Now that we all have our wet eyes, you know, gosh, what a beautiful, I think we're all on the edge of our seat with that one. So, you know, we're reaching, you know, to be mindful of time, I want to just ask one final question of everyone. You know, so what is your hope for the future of the trans community, as you were just speaking about, Ms. Dee Dee? And how does knowing our history inform the decisions we make now? We can start with you, Professor Amin, if you don't mind.
Yeah, it's a big question. My hope for the future of the trans community, you know, I think that one of the difficulties of trans politics and just being trans in general is how much transphobia surrounds us, obviously, right? And so I think a lot about how so much of our political discourse, our academic discourse, the way that we explain ourselves to others, even when it's positive, is a response to that transphobia, right? And my dream is for a time, right, and a series of spaces when trans people can speak, from their hearts without feeling the need to always respond to the transphobic voice that's in the audience, or that wrote the book before they got to write the book, or even that's in their heads when they're alone, right? So that we don't feel like we have to defend ourselves constantly and come up with reasons to legitimate ourselves in front of other people, right? But we can speak the raw and honest and complicated and beautiful truth, right? That is all of our lives. I think there's a way that, in order to make political gains, there are all kinds of strategies we engage in, and some of them can err towards a politics of respectability, right? Some of them can turn towards these this kind of narrative of pity, right? You should give us rights, you should be kind to us because look how we've suffered, right? Or look what we've had to bear in order to get here, right? And this is not to deny that many of us have suffered and are suffering, right? But that shouldn't be the reason why people allow us to transition or give us rights or allow us to teach or give us jobs or things like that. We should be allowed to be happy. We should be allowed to transition because we want to and no other reason, right? So I think that is my ultimate dream. And also we should be allowed to be imperfect people, right? We should be able to tell stories that aren't just stories of courage and triumph and bravery, right? And maintaining our moral status despite all these difficulties we've had to go through, right? We should be able to tell about the infighting and the pettiness, right? And the things that are not so pretty about just trying to survive without that delegitimizing us in the eyes of others, right? So I want it to be possible for us to have all these rich and complex and beautifully imperfect stories be a part of our story and our public face.
Really wonderfully said. Morna, Gerrard, do you mind?
Yeah. So, like as a fellow human, I guess I just want members of the trans community to be able to thrive and to live safe and healthy lives. I think that should be a right for everybody. And I want them to have all the rights that are afforded to me, or people who have even more rights than me. I think that's only fair. Something I feel really positive about is listening to my friends who have young children, young as in like toddler up to through teens, and they're the sort of many of their kids are either gender non-conforming or have lots of friends who are, and it's been certainly the experiences I'm seeing is it's becoming much more normal, and young kids just don't see that it's an issue, and I think that that's awesome, and I really have hopes that people are just people. It's like, let's just all be people, and I have a lot of hopes pinned on the younger generation, bless their hearts, and I feel sorry for them because of that. But this is an area where I really do have a great deal of optimism, because they see one another just as fellow human beings. And so that is great. As an archivist, I want more archivists to document the trans lives, the history of trans lives, so that they can be honored and made available for future generations. I think it's going to be super helpful to have for young people emerging who are figuring themselves out, to have access to these stories, and to have stories to be able to access stories from people who are maybe in their 80s now, people who are in their 60s, who are in their 20s, multiple generations, to understand, their the history of their community, but also to understand their place within that community and the strength of that community. You know, it is the case that there have been trauma and there have been, you know, really crappy things happen, but there's also been, you know, an incredible resiliency and strength as well. And I think especially young people, they're so well placed where they're having this world where it's not nearly as dangerous to be trans or to be gender non-conforming, but they also will potentially have all of these stories of the older generations to be able to give them comfort as they and guidance as they come through. So I feel very optimistic. I have a foot in realism as well, but I do feel optimistic about the future.
I feel optimistic too after this evening with all of you. Ms. Dee Dee, we'll finish up with you. What are your hopes for the trans community, and why do you think, and how does our histories inform that, the decisions that we make? Oh, I'm sorry, you're still muted.
My hope for the community is, you know, we have this Transgender Day of Remembrance, and to remember all the people that have passed before us, but that we will evolve to another level of advocacy than just having that day of remembrance. That it would build to something else much more tangible that's being put into place and done against hate crimes and violence against trans people. Hate crimes in general, violence in general. We are at the bottom of the barrels, so to speak. But, you know, maybe through our pain and our tenacity and resilience, you know, it will liberate everyone else to have the freedom to be themselves. You know, we don't ask for the freedom to be ourselves. We just be, you know. Just like something that we just cannot, is like goes against our nature, not to be who we are. And if people can understand that and see that, you know, the same thing that drives them to be heterosexual or whatever, that's the same thing that drives us to be who we are. And it's just not a choice. It's a choice between whether you want to live or die. Because if you die, that means you cannot be yourself. If you live, you can live so that others can live maybe better than you did. Yeah. And that we would get laws that would protect our vulnerable community.
I just want to thank all of you for participating, and just want to again say how honored I am to be in this conversation with you, that you gave up this time to be with us, to share of your experiences and your stories. I'm so grateful for all of the work that each of you are doing, and it's so exciting to hear more about it. As a young non-binary person myself, I am grateful so much for the work each of you has done to pave the way for me, and to to create a better world for all of us. And I also want to thank all of our attendees for joining us this evening and taking time out of your evenings. I hope you enjoyed this great conversation. And this discussion will be available on YouTube and our website at a later point. So if it's something you want to rewatch later or share with a friend, it'll be available for you. We also want to remind you that our podcast will hopefully launch at the beginning of 2022 with our first episode highlighting Miss Dee Dee and her story. And we hope to have more programs coming in 2022, as well as our in-person exhibit. Hopefully, once things with COVID make that more possible. But thank you all for tuning in this evening, and thank you to each of our panelists for participating. I wish you a wonderful rest of your Trans Week of Awareness.
Thank you.
Have a lovely evening.
Thank you so much.
No more.